Okay, welcome everyone. We're gonna let the Zoom room fill up for maybe another minute and then we'll get started. But welcome to today's book talk. Okay, so some folks are still entering, but we're gonna get started. Welcome to today's book talk, which is about the recently published, just last month actually, book Illusions of Control, Dilemmas in Managing U.S. Proxy Forces in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria, and it's by Dr. Erica Gaston, who is our guest today. And Quincy Institute is your host, and if you haven't been to one of our webinars before, or you're not familiar with us, we're a think tank based in Washington, D.C. that's focused on a more restraint-oriented U.S. foreign policy and one that's less rooted in international military adventurism and intervention and more rooted in diplomacy. And Dr. Erica Gaston heads the Conflict Prevention and Sustaining Peace Program at the United Nations University Center for Policy Research in New York. She has worked on conflict-related human rights, civilian protection, peace building, rule of law and security issues in Iraq, Afghanistan, Yemen, Syria, Pakistan, and she's done significant field work, which is the topic of the book. And she's collaborated with numerous organizations, and she is a non-resident scholar at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and GPPI, and her non-academic analysis has been featured in Lawfare, War on the Rocks, Foreign Policy, Al Jazeera, BBC, and other outlets. So let's get started. First of all, it's interesting that you have the word proxy in the title of your book, because U.S. policymakers, U.S. officials tend not to like that word. They'll say we have partners. Now, it doesn't matter that we have partners that we're paying salaries of in the hundreds of millions of dollars and that we're providing them weapons and training and at least attempting to direct them. We don't like the word proxy, except when it comes to, our foes in the region. We'll easily say that, we used to say that the Haqqani network was a proxy of Pakistan, even though now the Afghan Taliban and the Pakistani security forces are shooting at each other. We, of course, say the Houthis are a proxy of Yemen and so forth, but we don't like to use the word proxy for our own partners. But we do have proxies, don't we?
Indeed, yes. I think the US does have proxies. And I take your point. There is a little bit of a, terminology battle going on and preference for using partners, but you do see, US officials regularly use the term proxies, particularly when they're talking, there's a particular fund called that's available for special forces to support militias or rebel groups, and they'll regularly refer to that as a fund for supporting proxy forces. So it's even there. But yes, for sure, partner assistance is what we're talking about. That's the preferred terminology in DC. Whether you use the terms proxy warfare, as is more common in academia, or partner assistance, I think the issues are fundamentally the same. Oops, I think you might be muted still.
Oh, of course.
Yeah.
It's only been 4 years since the pandemic, and I'm still master the unmute button. Anyway, so for folks who don't have a background in political science or IR, what is a proxy? How would you define a proxy?
Right. So a proxy force is basically a force that's going to go out and do something for you. So perhaps you have there's a terrorist threat. There is a case of insurgency. There's some other security manifestation that's going on. Instead of directly sending your own forces, you're going to pay it could be another state's forces, could be non-state forces like the groups I talk about, so rebels or militia forces, but you're going to basically outsource that work to another force. They're going to act as a proxy for you. One thing to say, there's whole different kinds of proxy relationships. They're not always as direct as, hey, I want you to go do this, and then the force goes out and does it. Many cases, these forces are already fighting their own battle and have their own interests. And so they're happy to take funding, but might be pursuing their own agenda. That's often what creates a lot of the dilemmas in these proxy situations.
And your book uses different examples to talk about how U.S. policymakers decide whether it's preferable to use a proxy. For example, in the case of Syria, they didn't want to have US boots on the ground. They wanted to have as few US boots on the ground as possible. So there was an incentive to have a proxy force. Whereas in places like Afghanistan and Iraq, there were plenty of boots on the ground, but there was this feeling that US Marines and soldiers didn't have the communal knowledge to weed out the Taliban in Afghanistan or weed out Al Qaeda cells in Anbar province in Iraq. So, what are some of the considerations that would motivate US decision makers to use proxy forces vice US boots on the ground?
Right, exactly. So yes, in Syria, there was desire to have no boots on the ground or as minimal as possible. In Iraq and Afghanistan, even there were tens of thousands or over 100,000 forces, depending on the time period. It still was a bit of a savings in terms of troop deployment. So if you needed to suddenly surge and have 30,000 local forces to counter the Taliban in southern Afghanistan and to really give this momentum to the surge that was going on, and your options are, do you deploy more US forces, or do you try to get more Afghan forces, whether that's state or local forces? So that savings in terms of troops are still there, even if you've got high numbers of troops present. As you pointed out, sometimes it's not just numbers, sometimes it's local know-how and knowledge. So particularly in this sort of asymmetric conflicts where you're really talking about local insurgencies, local terrorist groups, or local grievances, the local fighters often know the area even better than, say, the national fighters that might be coming from the capital. They speak the local languages. They know exactly who's an insurgent or a terrorist affiliate and who's not, versus even outside forces from the province next door might not know them. So there's that local knowledge that happens. And then in some cases, in some situations, there's also a level of plausible deniability. So in some of the situations, there's also a desire to outsource to local forces, particularly these more kind of shadowy forces, because maybe they're involved in an area that the US doesn't prominently want to be involved in. And that's not the case in all proxy situations, but it is in some. The final point I just add, a lot of these forces are working as sort of parallel militia forces or taking support from different parts of the US military or in some cases intelligence forces. But also some of the groups that I was talking about, they're receiving support that goes directly through the State Department by civilian actors. In some of these cases, the proxy functions that they're being asked to do aren't necessarily warfighting, or they're not primarily security related. They're wanting to act as sort of local governance supports or controlling territory as opposed to other security actors.
And of course, one of the common themes in your book is competition between the Pentagon and the State Department over how to control these proxy forces and what degree of control should be exerted and whether there should even be proxy forces. But we'll get into that a little bit later. Your book delves into how how the US can try to exert oversight and control over these proxies. And it is an academic book, although it doesn't read like an academic book. It's actually, because it's so rich with case studies, it's actually a very easy read. But because it's an academic book, we have to start with the theoretical framework for it to make sense. So maybe you could give an overview to people who don't have a poli-sci background about principal agent theory versus bureaucratic policy analysis.
Right. So a lot of the academic literature that does deal with these proxy forces, these proxy relationships, one of the key frameworks that they'll adopt to look at it is called principal agent theory. And this originally derives from, economic, macroeconomic theory, and it sort of analogizes relationships in a contract. So in a contract, you have a principal and you have an agent, and the principal wants the agent to do something, and there are contract terms and penalties if they don't happen. And so what international relations or political science has done is they've sort of borrowed this construct, and they might analogize a relationship within foreign policy or even within domestic, between Congress and NGOs, between Congress and the executive branch, to this sort of principal agent, this contractual relationship. And the idea being that in certain cases, it's easier to delegate certain tasks out, saves you time. You might not have all the expertise, might be other benefits to doing so. But the problem with that is that agents have their own interests. They often have their own some of that might just be not working very hard. So they could slack off and not do things that the principal wants them to do. In some cases, they might be engaged in actions that actually create negative consequences. So they might say, well, you want me to go and fight over here, to take an example with our sort of forces, but I'm really interested in fighting these guys. And so even if that creates costs for you, that's what I'm going to do on the ground. So what principal agent theory says is that patrons know this, and they might try to institute these different control mechanisms that would allow them to reduce some of these risks. So they might say, well, I'm going to be really careful about selection, and I'm going to try and pick a like-minded agent, someone who thinks like me, has my same interests. I know he's a hard worker. I'll get less of this slack or divergence. Or they might say, I'm going to set out clear rules and standards, similar to in a contract, and then I will create different penalties, carrots and sticks, as well as sort of monitoring devices that will allow me to enforce those. So that's all great in theory, but if you take that analogy and you apply it to some of these conflict situations where you don't have a lot of ability to do any sort of monitoring, that's why you're delegating these tasks to these local forces to begin with. You don't necessarily know the local area well enough. It's really easy for them to go a completely different direction without the US government being aware. And then in terms of carrots and sticks, in some cases, yes, you could cut off funding. But if we're talking about the risk we were trying to prevent, were preventing war crimes from happening, preventing a major security incident that could compromise a relationship with a foreign partner, just threatening to cut off, their next round of AK-47s, it's not very much of a deterrent in that fact. And then think about also these environments. The reason that the US would be delegating to these agents in this case is often because it's a really high foreign policy priority. It's like we discussed, they don't want troops on the ground in Syria, but they want to go after ISIL. So in that case, what principal agent theory would say is where it's a really high value contract, then the agent basically is going to be able to have a lot more room to engage in slack or go a different direction because the patron just has to put up with it. And so again and again, these are the sort of consequences that, principal agent theory would expect and that we would see spanning out across these arenas.
And to make it a little bit less theoretical, I mean, a common theme in your book is that there's this issue of exigency. The Pentagon is freaking out because there's a problem, whether it's the Al-Qaeda in Iraq is starting to engage in all kinds of terrorism in Western Iraq and in Baghdad, and the ID deaths are skyrocketing for US troops. And so they need a partner who can go hunt Al-Qaeda, basically. Or in Afghanistan, this Taliban are regrouping, and they need partners that can hold in this counterinsurgency strategy they had. They were able to clear with US troops, but they weren't able to hold because the country was too vast. So they need a partner who can hold. So they developed the Afghan local police. Or in Syria, ISIS is rampaging through Syria and Iraq, and they need someone to fight them. But the Obama administration determines that due to domestic politics largely, and partly due to lessons learned from the Iraq War, it doesn't make sense to put US boots on the ground. So there's an emergency, and that's why these agents, whether it's the SDF or the Afghan local police or the Anbar Awakening tribal militias, are able to basically get the United States to turn a blind eye to a whole lot of bad behavior in some cases.
Yeah, the exigency is critical in all of these. I mean, this is why they're often, at the point when the US is often considering these militias, it's often tried other routes first. Maybe that was going through state partners, maybe it was considering other approaches, and they haven't seemed to work. And there's a flaming fire of a foreign policy crisis over here. And so often what you will hear from policymakers is that going this route, supporting rebels, supporting militias, was the least bad alternative that was presented. And so the interesting thing comes in is in all of the cases that I look at, is there's almost this this sort of dialogue going on where it's like, okay, well, given this exigency, given this extreme situation, we have to work with these guys. They're the only ones left. They're the only ones in position to do it. They're our best option, even if they're not a great one. but they've got all of these risks and consequences attached to them. And this is where this idea of controls comes in, because it creates this almost conceit that says, well, yes, they're bad actors. Yes, they're risky, but we've got all these mechanisms that allow us to address those risks. And so it sort of creates this slippery slope that makes it easier to authorize all of these different forces.
So let's get into a case study now. And we'll go back to the early 2000s. The US has invaded Iraq, toppled Saddam Hussein. There's this process of de-Baathification. Essentially, the Iraqi military, which was a major employer, is disbanded. And by the way, it was also a major employer of Iraqi Sunnis. So now you have all these disenfranchised Sunnis and just disenfranchised armed young men who have no livelihood now. And you start to see these tribal militias form, just groups of bandits even, and you also start to see Al-Qaeda in Iraq form, and things are getting out of control, especially in Al-Anbar, which is a province in Western Iraq. And a man named Sheikh Abdul Sattar goes to the US military and says, hey, I think we have a similar problem. You want to, take care of Al-Qaeda. I want to have my tribal authority back. These terrorist groups have stripped me of my tribal privileges. Now, Sattar is not necessarily the greatest guy. This tribal structure had existed. It was kind of banditry. You would have these strong men, tribal leaders who, in many cases, were thugs. But that was the order of the society, and Al-Qaeda was disrupting that. And Sattar starts to form these militias, and before you know it, we're paying $30 million a month in salaries to these Iraqi militias. And in the book, you describe recruitment as, quote, a walk-in affair. They were trying to stand up a resistance to Al-Qaeda in Iraq very quickly, and they wanted tough guys. They wanted thugs. They wanted people who could go find Al-Qaeda. They weren't looking necessarily for technocrats. They were looking for men who were used to killing. Let's be honest about that. And so that's who they recruited. And there wasn't that much vetting. In fact, vetting was counterproductive. That's what you write in your book. That was the mentality. We don't want to vet. If we vet, we won't be able to get the kind of people that we want. Who are going to be able to do this tough job. And there's a real exigency. And by the way, for those listening, if you really want to go into a deep dive of the Anbar Awakening, you can read Illusions of Victory, the Anbar Awakening and the Rise of the Islamic State by Carter Malkasian. It's a great book that goes into extreme detail. But I think I provided an overview here. Do you think that's accurate about what was going through the US military or the Pentagon's mind at the time?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so the Anbar Awakening, or Sons of Iraq, there's different names for it, the Sahwa, was interesting because that's definitely one that, it's not necessarily the US's brainchild or its starting strategy going into Iraq. This is something that, as you kind of pointed out, there were a lot of already local resistance among Iraqis who weren't happy with what AQI was doing. And this guy Sattar comes to, the local US commander and says, look, I'm ready to join forces with you. And it works. And organically, they start to develop this sort of model across Iraq, and it sort of takes on like wildfire. So it's interesting in some of the others where the US is really going out there initially looking for partners, and that's the strategy. This is something that sort of bubbles up from the bottom up. It seems to be working, and it's seized upon. You're absolutely right that vetting was not part of it. In fact, as part of the strategy was not just that you're going to have these local fighters who provide manpower and fight against AQI. It's that you were actually going to flip some of the same source of recruits or the same actors who would become AQI itself. So I had a chat with an intelligence officer who was working at the time, and his sort of take on it was, like baked into the strategy was that these were nasty guys. Like that's who you wanted to flip and come on board to your side. That's how you were going to turn the insurgency. So yes, exactly. You don't have anything like vetting or standards going in at this part. They only, interestingly, enter the picture when, the program bubbles up to such a level that it can no longer be hidden. Iraqi politicians, predominantly Prime Minister Maliki, are worried about this idea of raising a sort of what he considers to be a Sunni army against him. That's not his political base of support, to say the least. And so when they come into the picture and the US suddenly needs the Iraqi government to not only be okay with this, but hey, the idea is we'd like to get out of Iraq eventually, and you need to take over this program. That's when you start to see these language about vetting and standards and institutionalization and all that come in. It's part of the bargaining with Iraq. It doesn't come in as part of the US initial treatment of the program.
Yeah, and the Sahwa were quite successful in reducing violence in Anbar, but as you pointed out, Iraq is a majority Shia country, and Nouri al-Maliki didn't like the idea of having this power put in the hands of Sunni tribal leaders. And it's actually pressure from Maliki that begins to influence the US in terms of having more oversight. You actually use you describe this later in your book by saying control mechanisms emerged as a political tactic, not as an agent of control. Can you explain that a little more?
Yeah, so stepping back a little bit to what we talked about with theory. So when you dig into the academic literature, they'll have this theory. You get control mechanisms where principals are trying to control the agent and prevent them from doing bad behavior. But what you see again and again in the actual examples is that control mechanisms don't arise because, somebody sitting in the Pentagon is like, oh, we're really worried about the Sahwa going out and committing thuggery. They arose in the Sahwa case because the US had to go and then sell the project to the Iraqi government, who was worried about the background of these folks, who was saying, they could be AQI, they could be insurgents. We're generally suspicious of them. How can we control them? So they arose more out of a political need, a need to respond to the bargaining demands in this situation. And in fact, had very little to do with like whether they were actually going to control the forces in question.
So to put it in layman's terms, the US was willing to turn a blind eye to the thuggery as long as they were controlling AQI, but it was Shia Iraqi politicians who didn't like the idea of power being in the hands of their opponent or perceived opponents that made the US have to strike a compromise. Okay, we're going to rein them in a little bit so you can remain on board with this initiative.
Yeah, I think that's true. I do think some of the other case studies have a slightly different tenor to them. There are later ones where the US also is parts of the US administration or Congress or different actors in the US arena are bringing those concerns actually about conduct. And so it comes in a different point. But certainly in the Rock case, I think that's true. The concerns are coming from the other side.
Yeah, and actually a case in which at least the State Department was expressing concerns, and also some of our international partners, is the case of the Afghan local police. So let's talk about that a little bit. So around the same time, or a couple of years later, I believe it was 2008, U.S. Special Operations would embed in these local, very communities that they would pick where they thought there was a risk of Taliban resurgence. So it tended to be in the Pashtun belt in the south. And they would raise up these Afghan local police. Previously they had tried to create the Afghan National Police, but that wasn't that much of a success. Now, when the US first intervened in Afghanistan, as you describe it, they wanted to strengthen institutions. They wanted to have a neo-Weberian monopoly on force. But over time, it became clear that you needed to have community-based policing and forces in order to hold all of this territory, because the Afghan state simply wasn't strong enough or big enough to do all of it. And US troops at this time were, of course, distracted in Iraq, so we didn't have enough US troops in Afghanistan either. And so the Afghan local police are created, but they're developed at a much slower pace. And there's a little bit more emphasis early on about oversight. Is that right?
Yeah, the Afghan local police, in some ways, they're inspired by what happens in Iraq, by the Sahwa, by this bottom-up forces. One, it seemed to work there. They're kind of struggling with some similar dilemmas in Afghanistan in terms of, they want to surge troops, but they need some forces to be behind to hold them. It seems like, hey, maybe this is even more appropriate in Afghanistan because you have this strong culture of local community control, decentralization, much more so than in Iraq. So they're definitely inspired by the Sahwa, but in many ways, the way that these forces get stood up is very different. It's not the way that we just talked about in Iraq, where it starts by a local guy coming up to US commanders and then that sort of blossoming bottom up. This is very much a top-down initiative that initially special forces are piloting these. They're going out to communities and trying to select ones that they think will actually be good forces, not only in terms of like, will they be able to hold off the Taliban, but will they present a better alternative in terms of their conduct than either the Afghan state has to this point or than Taliban forces. So they are looking for good counterinsurgents, not just militarily strong ones. So they go out and they're initially doing these pilots. And so to some extent, some of those good conduct standards are a little bit more present from the beginning in the Afghanistan because of the different context and because of the situation there. But it really comes out differently when this initiative sort of goes up for authorization. So basically, special forces are there. They're starting these little tiny pilot experiments that allow them to stand up like a couple hundred forces in key areas. But they think for this to have a strategic effect, it's got to go nationwide. And we got to have it synced in with a larger strategy, meaning governance, development, what we're doing with Afghan forces, all the whole thing of it. So for that, they need more money, which the US ambassador at the time, who is himself concerned about unruly behavior, this is Caroline Eikenberry, says, I'm worried about this program. It looks like a quick shortcut to trouble. And, I'm putting a hold on the funds. So they need the funding. But they also, because they need all these other parts of the international, apparatus, not just in the US government, but all the other agencies to kind of buy into it and work for it to be this sort of counterinsurgent momentum, they need others to buy into it too. So there's this period, and I was there in Afghanistan at the time working in a different job and could see it. And would, they'd be literally, it's amazing to think of special forces going out and doing sort of like, like an open talk with NGOs, with ambassadors, with Afghan officials to really give them a sense of their program and try to get buy-in for this operation. And it's when they're trying to get that buy-in against this whole crowd of policymakers, NGOs, whoever, who are really skeptical about this. Because if there's one country that might give you pause about mobilizing militias, it's Afghanistan. From, decade on decade of examples of them committing war crimes and abuses, to them contributing to the collapse of the state in the 1990s, to the most famous example of proxy blowback, which is when the US-backed fighters, the militias that were fighting against the Soviet in the 1980s, later spin off and part of them become Al-Qaeda. So if there's a country where you might think twice about mobilizing militias, it's Afghanistan. And all of these concerns are raised to special forces and other proponents. They'll say, hey, this is going to unleash unruly forces. This is maybe only going to feed other warlords and sources of conflict. This will undo everything we've been doing for the last decade in terms of disarmament, in terms of state building. And to each of those different kind of concerns and complaints, to kind of win all of these different folks on board, special forces, other proponents say, don't worry about that. This time we're going to do it differently. We are going to do thorough background checks. We're embedding these in communities, so they've got built-in restraints. We are going to embed in communities to have this other level of discipline. We're going to have cutoffs. They're going to get human rights training. Basically, all of these different means to try and rebut one by one the different objections. You're concerned about their engagement in detention operations. We'll put that in the rule book. Can't engage in detention operations. Whatever it was. And so it's much more in this time period where there's an open sort of discussion and deliberation and bargaining for a range of different actors, that you see this program of standing up militias get just embedded with all of these controls.
And to be fair, this is kind of the special forces bread and butter. And just to be clear, I think special forces, special operations, I get used interchangeably sometimes, but special forces, the Green Berets, and special operations is a bigger umbrella. But in the case of special forces, the Green Berets, this really is their bread and butter, where they go in and they embed in communities, and they are professionals at this. And I assume they liked this mission.
Yes, no, absolutely. I didn't want to get too into jargony, but they will sometimes say, for the sort of white SOF or white special operations forces are the ones that go out and do these sort of community engagement versus the black SOF that might be doing your sort of targeted operations. You're going after Osama bin Laden or things like that. And so, yes, these white SOF, these Green Berets, this is what they're, trained up to do. And this is much more what they would rather be doing than, kicking down doors and things like that. And so they really embrace this. And a lot of them really saw this as the best chance for, like, they drank the Kool-Aid in a sense. They thought this was the best way that you were going to be able to get in there in a very tribal society and actually turn things around. And turn things around, and I don't just mean in a superficial way. A lot of them were arguing for this to be, a multi-generational or multi-decade commitment, really buying as much into the governance and development side of it as any military side of it, because that was the fundamental issue they were seeing, was the disconnect with the Afghan government. So, to give them credit, they were not the ones that were in favor for the most part of this just becoming like another paramilitary force.
And of course, that fear of it becoming another paramilitary force also plays into ethnic tensions in Afghanistan, just as the Sahwa played into sectarian tensions in Iraq. And you have because it makes sense to raise these Afghan local police in the Pashtun heartland, because that's where the Taliban is. You have some non-Pashtuns in the north calling the ALP a Pashtun handout program and feeling that they're not getting the piece of the pie that they deserve.
Right, exactly. So, I mean, interestingly, one of the initial control mechanisms or things that the special forces proposed to prevent this project, from just creating all of these bad consequences, was to pay attention to local community dynamics, to not be standing up these forces in communities that didn't want it, or where it seemed like they were going to be prone to manipulation by some of these ethnic rivalries or warlords or things like that. And both because of that, and because there was most of the fighting that needed to happen was in the South. That's where the Taliban were. They had sort of ruled out initially putting any of these forces in most of the North. But of course, when it gets to this bargaining moment, it gets to this request for authorization. The Afghan government has got to approve it. Half of the Afghan government, the vice president, senior parts of the cabinet, they all hail from these northern communities who are like, hey, we're also we're aware of Afghanistan's history, and we know what it means when you like mobilize other groups, militias, and not ours, and we don't want to be left out of this program. So it's interesting because in this context, in a way, the bargaining sort of cuts down on some of the real controls that actually might have controlled some of the problems and issues with behavior.
So when you say it cuts down on some of the real controls, you think that are you suggesting that there was a sort of the emphasis became on appearances of control rather than actual control? Hey, we're going to try to. We have the NGOs that are complaining, Karzai is complaining, Ambassador Eikenberry is complaining. We need to come up with a list of controls that's going to allow everyone to save face and respond to their complaints, but it might not actually be effective.
Right. Most of the control mechanisms that actually just get approved and get part of the project, part of the program for the ALP, are the ones that were needed to satisfy some of these different critics so that you could get the program authorized. The ones that SOF themselves, the special forces themselves, thought were actually going to do the best job of addressing concerns with these forces, a lot of those just kind of fell off the table. They weren't necessary to get it authorized, or they were directly antithetical to what some of these other bargaining players were asking for. So, yes.
Can you give an example, like some real world examples about where these tensions were?
So the issue with the North was one of them. I mean, they thought a lot of the communities in the North were just sort of, absolutely, if you stood up militias in some of those communities, it was just going to become prey to warlords. Rather than helping the issue, it would feed conflict. And that's one of the things that this is a demand of kind of parts of Karzai's government. And that was one restraint that just gets left on the table immediately for it to be authorized. Another was that they really placed a big emphasis on having some of these forces come under community control. So like really making sure that like tribal elders or those in a community had a say in who was chosen and whether there was going to be a force present or not. And we're really suspicious of too much bringing in of the Afghan state, because at that point, there's already a huge problem of corruption within the Afghan state, and also just a lot of bad behavior by the Afghan police in particular. So they almost didn't want it to be corrupted. But again, in order to get the Afghan government to buy into it, number one request that they have, it comes under Afghan institutions. So in the end, these forces come under, the chief of police in each local area, which in many of the areas where these forces are then mobilized becomes a real corrupting force. These become basically a sort of like paramilitary forces of this cronyistic local police commander rather than something that can actually kind of speak up for communities.
I'm going to ask a provocative question, which doesn't necessarily reflect my real beliefs, but you write something in your book. I forget the exact phrase you used about how, in the case of Iraq, the U.S. military would just go ahead with an idea, and it didn't matter if the Iraqi government acquiesced or not. They would go ahead with it first. And in Afghanistan, it seems like there was more concern over what the Afghan government thought, even though they were completely reliant on the U.S. Do you think, I mean, it strikes me that a criticism of this strategy could be if you're going to stand up a government in a foreign country, if you're going to have military intervention, and if you're going to stand up proxies, just admit that you're in control. Why care so much? To some extent, could somebody say, who cares what Karzai thought? Why was so much why were there these concessions? Why didn't the US say, hey, you exist because of us, and we're going to go ahead and do this our way, whether you like it or not?
Yeah. No, it's an interesting question. It is provocative. I do think, just having worked in these environments, there is, I think US officials are uncomfortable sometimes with the fact that in certain situations they have, held most of the power of making decision making and are not comfortable with that position. And so some of that is just the way that they approach situations. But the dynamics were slightly different as well. I think in Iraq, it's critical to remember that it's not just that they had, over 100,000 US forces there. In a lot of the cities and towns where they were operating, there are no more Iraqi officials left. It's US actors that are working with local actors as well that are playing the predominant role. And it was I mean, go back to the Iraqi civil war, like it's hard to the degree of violence, the degree of just outright atrocities and sort of chaos that was happening at the peak, just bodies dumped in the ground. The exigency was so high that I think there was a greater willingness to just say, we're going to do what we have to do. And you don't feel that same sense when you talk to US officials that were serving in Afghanistan at the same time. There was a level of exigency, but it wasn't that point. So I think that created a slight difference. But I think the other difference was that the strategy meant that they needed the Afghan government to be part of it. So the whole counterinsurgency strategy in Afghanistan was that the way that you would beat the Taliban was by supporting an Afghan government that's a more credible alternative, that is able to actually protect civilians as opposed to unleashing forces that can be themselves abusive, corrupt, and predatory, and that can actually deliver services, that can actually do something meaningful there. And so in order for this to work, you didn't need to just stand up, pockets of stability that are entirely dependent on US forces or US supported forces. You needed the Afghan government to be the one that was seen to be supporting that security and the governance. And so that's why I think to some degree they needed much more of the Afghan one. And then I would finally just note that too, I think in Afghanistan, it's important to remember that it is a much more diverse sort of environment, also just on the international side. So in Iraq, there were other partners, but the US is really, the 800-pound gorilla. It wasn't, at the command level, it wasn't really checking in a whole lot with a lot of its coalition allies and things like that. Versus in Afghanistan, there was always much more burden sharing. There were different countries that were responsible in each province. And so part of it is not just the Afghan government, but needing everybody else to go along as well.
And as you point out in your book, the U.S. military commander in Afghanistan was also the ISAF commander. So they wore two hats, and so they had to be accountable to the other partners. Somebody in the chat asks, do you think standing up the ALP without, kind of making the mission vulnerable to Afghan government corruption was an impossible task? because as you say, they needed to have the Afghan government involved, but the Afghan government also tended to tarnish things.
Yeah, I think it's a really great point. I don't know that there would have been a way, you know, at that point, Afghan security forces, had more so the police, the army had sort of a better reputation overall. And that's why when the US goes in to do this again a decade later, and it says, let's start over, the AOP messed up, let's create a new tribal force, they put it under the army rather than the police the next time. So I do think there possibly could have been institutional arrangements that would have made it less vulnerable to corruption than putting it directly under the Ministry of Interior and the police. But it would have been tough. That was a dilemma that they simply would have had with almost any degree of engagement of the Afghan government at that point.
Yeah. And I remember, so I served in Afghanistan. I remember that our perceptions of the police were quite different than the army. We didn't take the police as seriously, and we didn't trust them as much.
Yeah.
Simply put. Let's move on to another example. We've talked about the Afghan example. We've talked about the Iraqi example, in which there's a bargaining that's happening within the U.S. government itself, with allies on the ground, really, and with the proxy, so to speak. But in the case of the Syrian Democratic Forces, for one, we have a proxy that is much better, I think, at advocating for itself and bargaining than these other proxies we've mentioned. And we also have the issue of Turkey, in which we're bargaining with Turkey. And without doing a deep dive, basically there's this time period in which the United States is trying to support Syrian rebels, but it doesn't work out very well. And there is a point in time when even the US and Turkey are working together to support Syrian rebels, but the Turks want to support more of the Islamist factions, and the United States is wary of that. And some Turkish officials criticize the U.S. of believing that any Islamist rebel group in Syria is Al-Qaeda, but in their view, that's not the case. And so you have this drifting where there initially is some meeting of the minds between Turkey and the U.S. They're drifting apart, and then you have ISIS come onto the stage, and ISIS becomes the top priority of the Obama administration. And so you have the Syrian Democratic Forces who are effective at fighting ISIS. Now, the Syrian Democratic Forces is a coalition of different groups, but the leadership of it really is the YPG, and the YPG is very closely related to the PKK, and the PKK is a terrorist group according to both the Turkish and US government. And when you talk to Turks, especially Turkish government officials, they see no difference between the YPG and the PKK, and really they barely see a difference between the SDF and the PKK. And in their minds, we are literally supporting their Al-Qaeda. It is their number one, in their perception, number one security threat. And it simply can't be exaggerated. Is that right?
Absolutely. Yeah. You're phrasing like, to them, this is supporting their Al-Qaeda. This is and directly on their border. This is arming their version of Al-Qaeda directly on their border. So this is something that for them is just, it's an issue that can't be massaged. This is a fundamental existential threat. And the interesting thing, and this is where I think you get into really what are some of the risks of trying to go down this route of control mechanisms. We've talked about, we got a little bit, what if they just don't work? Two, what if they sort of become a little bit of a blind to allow you to kind of authorize risky forces that maybe we shouldn't have stood up to begin with. And the third is where they just really sort of paper over irreconcilable, like fundamental trade-offs within a foreign policy decision. And that's what I think the Turkish SDF illustrates. So exactly as you said, no way Turkey is going to accept or be happy about this at all. The US says, well, we think we have to work with the SDF because they're the only force. We tried every other force we could in Syria. This is the only one that we think can actually defeat the Islamic State, short of putting US forces on the ground. So they say, okay, that's a problem. We don't want to lose our relationship with this major NATO ally. But what we're going to do instead, we're going to go to Turkey and we're going to say, look, you shouldn't be so worried about this. We're going to track all of the weapons and we'll even show you the stockpile list. We'll show you all the weapons we're giving them and let you know that they're accounted for. We will vet all of these folks. We'll make sure there's no terrorist in there. There's no PKK within them. We're going to give them training. They do all of the same things that we've talked about in Iraq and Syria to try to find a middle ground between Turkey's outright hostility and losing them as a partner in doing this. And of course, the Turks are having none of this. This is a solution that works really well in Washington, D.C. It seems like we're finding a middle ground, but no middle ground exists. And so rather than having to come to terms with the sort of fundamental trade-offs as this decision, you get the US like neither deciding to accept that the cost to its relationship with Turkey, nor deciding to forego working with the SDF. And so it can be really dangerous as sort of a policy blind on top of everything else.
Yeah, you used the phrase papering over. In your book, you write that U.S. officials try to nuance the issue. I would actually use the phrase diplomatic gaslighting, because when I've talked to U.S. officials who work on Turkey, I mean, it's very difficult to get them to sort of speak frankly on this issue. It oftentimes really does sound like just a word salad. Well, the SDF and the YPG, well, they're different, and I mean, and it really, I mean, there are some differences. There is some nuance, but I think to Turkey, it really sounds like if we were to say, well, the National Guard isn't really the U.S. Army proper, so you shouldn't be worried. The National Guard actually doesn't represent the U.S. Army. I mean, that's, I think, what it sounds like to them. And it has made it that so that U.S.-Turkey relations are just, well, they're transactional at best, and really, I think could better be described as dysfunctional.
Yeah, I think, a lot of people will say that's one of the biggest costs coming out of the Syrian conflict from a foreign policy perspective. Obviously the huge loss of life is the predominant issue, but from a diplomatic perspective is the sort of rupturing in the cost to the relationship with Turkey.
Do you think there's a way out of this quagmire? Because it seems to me that you have CENTCOM forming deep relationships with the SDF at a personal level, because also the U.S. advisors are doing 5-6 deployments with the same people, and ISIS does remain an issue. And I think there's this fear, of course, that if we were to leave Syria, we'd be leaving behind our partners to just be killed by the Turks. And so we're stuck in this holding pattern in which we can't leave Syria, and the U.S.-Turkey relationship is held hostage by this issue, and there doesn't seem to be a way out. Do you have any sense of if there is a way out?
Yeah, I mean, in a way, it's amazing that it's gone on this long and it continues to sort of tick over in this, and I think that's because there doesn't seem to be a good direction either way. And so again, rather than trying to, choose one option and try and recover the position, I think that things just end up being stuck in this status quo. But you're definitely right that some degree of it, and you see this in this sort of going back into the record of how this decision was taken, how this relationship was developed, there is a bit of, almost clientelism, or sort of, for those that were in the military, the SDF, they were probably the most functional force they had worked with in several decades across the region. Were actually capable, competent, better controlled, had better language and walking the talk in terms of women's rights and issues like that. So compared to all of the different rebel forces and efforts that tried before that just didn't work, there was a sense that, hey, this force really works. Versus on the same side, this was not a unanimous view. You had a lot of people in the State Department that from the beginning were concerned about the relationship with Turkey, also were concerned about the consequences for other communities in Syria. And so it wasn't an easy decision. I don't want to make it seem like that, but yeah.
Let's talk about, and of course, somebody pointed out in the chat, actually, before I move on, that some of this is wrapped up in Turkey's own abuse of its Kurdish population, and I think to some extent Turkish fears about the empowerment of the SDF have demotivated the Turkish state from engaging in the kind of outreach with its own Kurdish population, and even with the PKK, that might have led to a more sustainable solution. So that's a factor as well. But we have 10 minutes left, so maybe we can talk about some of the conclusions, some of the findings, some of the lessons learned that you found from this research. And we haven't even gotten to speak about Leahy laws or anything like that yet.
Mhm.
So what are, if you could list a few takeaways that you would want a reader to come away from with after reading this, come away with after reading this book, what would they be?
So a lot of what I walk through these different case studies and what these different efforts to control mechanisms achieved. And, a lot of them wouldn't argue you shouldn't be thinking about human rights, concerns or trainings or controls or things like that. But what's kind of more concerning in each of these is again and again, we see them playing this role that's almost just a bit of a political sort of facade or a political tactic that not only doesn't get at the real issue, doesn't seem likely to address the human rights risks involved, doesn't seem likely to address the security risks, and is quite costly to implement. Like, takes a lot of time, effort, and billions of dollars of US money to do anyway. So it's not working, and instead it seems to be creating these other policy consequences. So we've given a couple of examples where having these controls in place, having this idea that you could address the risks, might have made it more likely that you would authorize them. So the larger risk here is that you end up while pretending to yourself that you're addressing some of these problems, you're actually getting the US to support riskier forces and situations. So you could be contributing towards political outcomes, whether on the ground for US foreign policy interests, for the communities involved. So I think that's the danger, is sort of relying too much on this idea that you can, kind of use these little technical controls that are really good at sort of getting the bill through Congress or getting it off of the State Department floor, but really don't have a lot to do with whether you're going to actually be able to address the consequences on the ground.
You said something earlier during this talk, which is, if we had such control on the ground, we wouldn't need these proxies to begin with. So, I mean, how good are we at monitoring and having these controls? I mean, you're suggesting basically that it's a veneer of control, really.
Yeah, so I mean, in places where we have a lot of forces present, sometimes there can be. So in some of the situations, like in Iraq and Afghanistan, you could have some degree. But so I interviewed most of my research, it's not from desk research, it's from going out to the field. And it's also from talking to those that were involved in these debates, whether that's Afghan or Iraqi officials, or whether it's talking to the US forces who are engaging. And you talk to a lot of the US forces who are at the sort of tip of the spear trying to manage these, and they will have the same concerns. They'd be like, I'm really concerned about forces that I might supervise that would go out and like sell the weapons on the black market or commit abuses. But they'll say, I can tell you from my military training that me just giving them a 6-hour training on human rights and sending them out into Syria with absolutely no ability for us to engage, to monitor, just telling them to radio back in and submit a report or take a video when they fire a tow missile, and we'll check up and see if you hit civilians with it. That is absolutely no way to control this. They will say that themselves. That's not what their entire institutionalization as a military professional would tell them. And so, yeah, these little sort of tweaks or like check the box. Briefly, you mentioned Leahy law standards. That comes in a lot throughout the book. It's, in some ways, it introduces the conversation about human rights risks within US policy debates. That's helpful. But when you talk about what does it actually do to control these forces, what it actually is you take the commander of a militia force, let's say in Syria, and you run it through a database that's in Washington, D.C. Maybe this guy's a terrible guy, but it's just never surfaced in any media report because there has been no media reporting in that town for 10 years. Or maybe it did surface in a report, but we've transliterated his name from Arabic and we've spelled it wrong, so it didn't hit a ding on that one. Or maybe the real problem is the 5 guys under him and not that commander, but we only do a commander check. So how would we know that anyway? It's really a check that's not a check, and that's the problem.
Yeah, yeah, it makes sense. We're just not equipped to operate in these opaque environments, and these bureaucratic mechanisms aren't suited for these opaque wartime environments.
Yeah. Right.
We have 5 minutes left. Maybe we can ask some more out of the box questions that are a little bit bigger. Somebody in the chat asked, could a state become a de facto proxy force?
Absolutely. Many times, much of the literature on proxy warfare is where states are a proxy of another one. So, there's a long history, for example, of the US relying on different states within the Middle East as a proxy against others, and that flipping back and forth. Or there will be discussion about, sub forces, like people would say, can talk about, for example, the regional Kurdish forces, which are a subsidiary regional force within Iraq. So they are a state force, but they're a sub-regional one as a proxy against others. So absolutely, they can very much be that.
Another person asks a question, are there lessons from your research for the relationship between the US government and other governments we provide heavy military support to, such as Ukraine, as an example?
Yeah, this is a really interesting question. So one, just on with other governments, I would say that the US has kind of gone down this road the most, but I did interview, for example, lots of other NATO partner states who sometimes have the same dilemmas. A lot of them would say we would never, do something like vetting all of our forces because we don't have the resources for it, but they may face the same dilemmas in terms of mitigating risks. But is it relevant in those partner assistance situations? Certainly. So there have been discussions about supporting civil defense forces in Ukraine, also in Taiwan, so in other state-on-state conflicts. While they aren't exactly the same dilemmas that would be faced with Syrian rebels, every context is different. Some of the lessons in terms of the challenges of how do you actually control partner forces or make sure they're not engaging in behavior that you wouldn't want US funding to be supported, they're all sort of implicated in those as well.
For what's probably the last question, somebody asked, don't these problems really stem from our interventionist policies, less intervention, fewer problems? And I'm going to add something to that question. Alternatively, could it be that with less intervention comes more problems with proxies? Because in some sense, we don't want to have boots on the ground, but we still want to be a player on the ground, and we still feel that there's these security threats like ISIS that requires a U.S. response, but with less boots on the ground. Now, granted, we have 900 U.S. troops in Syria, but that's not that big compared to past interventions. So, or does it require changing the mindset about intervention altogether, which is that maybe we shouldn't have boots on the ground and maybe we shouldn't have proxies on the ground either? Or is that something that's politically unrealistic?
Yeah, it is a really tough question. I mean, I think Syria really brings a lot of these dilemmas to the fore, where exactly as you said, the desire not to have intervention in Syria, not to have boots on the ground, not to, create a no-fly zone or have any airspace issues, was a lot of what drove the US to support in succession different types of proxy forces. I detail 5 in my book. There were other different initiatives going on. So we're talking many, many. And was that the best way to respond to the situation? Like, if we decided the issues in Syria, whether the issues in terms of the abuses that were the result of the Assad regime's response to opposition, or whether we're talking about terrorist threats like ISIS, if we decided they were actually imperative enough that something had to be done with it, was proxy forces the best way to go about that? A lot of people would look at Syria as a case of what happens in cases of omission or unwillingness to intervene as much as one of intervention. Often the part of the problem with proxy forces is it's sort of half in, half out. So you're still engaging and you can still do a lot of damage with it, but maybe you're not engaging enough to actually address some of the issues on the ground.
Yeah. In some ways, I think sometimes we delude ourselves that we're not involved in interventions, or we're not involved in wars abroad when we are, even if it's with a few hundred advisors, but we're still using a proxy force, and we're very much shaping conditions on the ground, either for the better or for the worse. With that, we're probably going to have to close, but I encourage everyone to read Illusions of Control, Dilemmas in Managing U.S. Proxy Forces in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria. It is an academic book, but like I said, it's a highly readable academic book, and I don't think you have to be a PhD to read it because the case studies are so illustrative of the theory. and it's actually quite interesting, and it reads like a history in many cases, and it's just filled with amazing quotes from State Department officials and special forces guys, and you have to read it to get all of those. I tried to share a few of them, but it's very rich. It's very well researched. I think the paperback is available now from Columbia Press and also even on Amazon. So get yourself a copy, and thanks for joining us, Erica. And do you have any future research or upcoming projects that you'd like to share?
Thank you. Yeah, no, thank you for promoting it. And I'm glad to finally see it out there. My day job is working with UN University Center for Policy Research. So we're doing a number of projects looking at similar issues, but particularly, areas where the UN is engaging with these. So yeah, I'd love to stay tuned and be in touch for future work.
Okay, thanks for joining, and thanks everyone else for listening.